My name is Emma Davis, 29 years old, and I always believed that family meant protecting each other, especially when someone was vulnerable. I spent 8 years thinking every cruel thing my stepbrother Kyle did to me was just sibling rivalry, even when I ended up in the emergency room twice because of his so-called pranks. When he grabbed my prescription glasses off my face during our family barbecue in Powell and snapped them in half while laughing, I expected my family to finally see what had been happening all along. Instead, my stepmother Linda looked me straight in the eye and said, "Emma, you know Kyle would never hurt you on purpose. Stop being so dramatic about a simple accident." What she didn't know was that Dr. Michael Chen's detailed report about my injuries would expose 8 years of lies and how completely their denial would backfire. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose to understand why that moment at the barbecue changed everything, you need to know how our blended family came to be, and why I spent so many years making excuses for Kyle's behavior. My parents divorced when I was 15, a relatively amicable split that left me living primarily with my dad Robert in Columbus, Ohio. Dad was a gentle man who worked as an accountant for a small firm downtown, and for 3 years it was just the two of us figuring out how to navigate life after Mom moved to California for a new job. Those were actually some of my happiest memories, coming home from high school to find Dad attempting to cook dinner, both of us laughing as we ordered pizza instead when his culinary experiments failed spectacularly. Everything changed when I turned 18 and started my freshman year at Ohio State University. Dad met Linda Morrison at a continuing education class they were both taking at the community college. Linda was recently divorced herself, with 2 sons from her previous marriage. Kyle was 21 at the time, working construction and still living at home, while Jake was 15 and finishing high school. When Dad first started talking about Linda, I was genuinely happy for him. He seemed lighter, more energetic than he had been since the divorce, and I wanted nothing more than for him to find happiness again. The first time I met Linda and her sons was at a casual dinner at our house during my sophomore year. Linda seemed pleasant enough, a chatty woman who worked as a dental hygienist and had strong opinions about everything from politics to proper table manners. Jake was quiet and polite, reminding me a bit of myself at that age, shy but observant. Kyle, however, made an impression I should have paid more attention to. He spent most of the dinner making subtle jokes at my expense, commenting on my choice to major in graphic design instead of something more practical, questioning whether I really needed to wear glasses or if they were just for show, and making pointed remarks about how college students today were too soft and privileged. At the time, I brushed off his comments as awkward attempts at humor from someone who didn't know how to interact with his potential new stepsister. Dad seemed oblivious to the undercurrents, too focused on making sure Linda felt welcome in our home. When I tried to mention later that Kyle seemed a bit hostile, Dad dismissed my concerns, saying Kyle was probably just nervous about the family dynamic changing and that I should give him time to warm up to me. Dad and Linda married in a small ceremony 8 months later, when I was halfway through my junior year at Ohio State. I was genuinely supportive of their relationship, happy to see Dad in love again, and hopeful that our new blended family would bring more joy and connection into all our lives. Linda moved into our house in German Village with Jake, while Kyle moved into an apartment nearby, though he spent most evenings and weekends at the house anyway. The transition seemed smooth on the surface. Linda was an excellent cook and enjoyed hosting family dinners every Sunday, creating traditions she said would help us all bond as a real family. It was during these early months of blended family life that Kyle's behavior toward me began to escalate beyond uncomfortable comments into what he insisted were harmless pranks. The first incident happened during a Sunday dinner about 2 months after the wedding. I had just gotten new prescription glasses, finally replacing the old wire frames I had worn throughout high school with more modern rectangular lenses that I felt confident wearing. Kyle commented that they made me look pretentious, like I was trying too hard to appear intellectual. When I ignored his remark and continued eating, he reached across the table as if to grab the salt shaker and knocked my glasses off my face onto my plate, which was full of spaghetti and marinara sauce. The glasses landed lens down in the sauce, and when I carefully lifted them out, one lens was completely coated and the frame was bent. Kyle immediately started laughing and apologizing simultaneously, saying he was so sorry but I should have seen my face. It was hilarious. Linda and Dad both assured me it was clearly an accident, that Kyle felt terrible about it, and that of course they would pay to have my glasses cleaned and the frame adjusted. I spent the rest of the dinner wiping sauce off my glasses with my napkin, trying to ignore Kyle's continued chuckling every time he looked at me. Looking back, that incident established a pattern that would continue for years. Kyle would do something that caused me physical discomfort or embarrassment, immediately apologize while making it clear he found the situation amusing, and the adults would rush to reassure everyone that it was just an unfortunate accident. I would be left feeling frustrated and confused, wondering if I was overreacting to what everyone else seemed to consider harmless mishaps. The second major incident occurred during my senior year at Ohio State, when I was home for spring break. I had been working late into the night on my senior portfolio, a comprehensive collection of graphic design work that would largely determine my final grade and job prospects after graduation. I had spread everything out on the dining room table, carefully organizing months of work into a coherent presentation. My laptop was open with digital files, printed samples were arranged in specific sequences, and I had notebooks full of design concepts and client feedback scattered across the surface. I had fallen asleep at the table around 3 in the morning, exhausted from trying to perfect every detail. When I woke up around 7, I found Kyle in the kitchen making coffee. He was friendly and talkative, asking about my project and seeming genuinely interested in my work for the first time since I had known him. I was pleased by his apparent change in attitude and happy to explain what I was working on, showing him some of the designs I was most proud of. He asked if he could look through everything while I took a quick shower before Dad and Linda woke up. When I came back downstairs 20 minutes later, I found chaos. My laptop was closed and pushed to one side of the table, but all my printed materials were stacked in a single pile, completely out of order. Coffee had been spilled across several important pieces, leaving brown stains on work I had spent weeks perfecting. My notebooks were scattered on the floor, as if they had been knocked off the table. Kyle was nowhere to be found, but I could hear the shower running upstairs in his old room, where he still stayed occasionally when he was too tired to drive home.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I spent the next 4 hours trying to salvage what I could and recreate the damaged pieces. When Kyle finally came downstairs, he was full of apologies and claimed that he had accidentally knocked over his coffee mug while looking at my work, then tried to clean it up but made things worse in his panic. He offered to pay for reprinting anything that was ruined and seemed genuinely distressed about the accident. Dad and Linda were sympathetic but encouraged me to see it as a learning experience about backing up my work and being more careful about where I left important projects. The most troubling part was that several of my best pieces, ones that I distinctly remembered being in perfect condition the night before, now had small tears or creases that looked deliberate rather than accidental. When I mentioned this to Dad, he suggested that I might be stressed about graduation and seeing problems that weren't really there. Linda added that Kyle had specifically told her how bad he felt about ruining my project, and that it was unfair of me to suggest he had damaged my work on purpose when he was already beating himself up about an honest mistake. These incidents continued with increasing frequency after I graduated and started working as a graphic designer at Creative Solutions Agency in downtown Columbus. Every family gathering seemed to involve some mishap that left me embarrassed, uncomfortable, or dealing with damaged belongings. Kyle would bump into me while I was holding drinks, causing spills on my clothes. He would playfully shove me in ways that sent me stumbling into furniture or other people. He had an uncanny ability to accidentally step on my feet with his work boots just hard enough to leave bruises. Each incident was followed by immediate apologies and family discussions about how these things happen and how important it was not to let accidents create tension in our new family dynamic. The financial aspect of Kyle's accidents became particularly frustrating as I tried to establish myself professionally. My starting salary at the agency was modest, and I was living in a small apartment in German Village, trying to build up savings while paying off student loans. Yet it seemed like every month I was replacing something Kyle had accidentally broken or damaged. My phone screen cracked when he bumped my arm as I was getting it out of my purse. My favorite coffee mug, a gift from my college roommate, shattered when Kyle gestured enthusiastically during a conversation and knocked it off the counter. A sweater I had saved up to buy got snagged on his watch when he gave me what he called a friendly hug, leaving a prominent pull in the fabric. Each time Kyle offered to replace what he had damaged, but his offers were always paired with comments about how I needed to be more careful or less clumsy myself. He would suggest that I was accident-prone, or that I made people nervous because I was always worried about my belongings getting damaged. Gradually, I found myself taking extra precautions around Kyle, keeping my purse close, holding drinks with both hands, and trying to maintain physical distance during family gatherings. The most disturbing pattern was how Kyle's accidents seemed to target things that were important to me, or that represented my independence and success. He never accidentally damaged Dad's belongings, or Linda's possessions with the same frequency. Jake, who was generally quiet and kept to himself, never seemed to be involved in any mishaps with Kyle at all. It was as if Kyle had an invisible radar for anything that mattered to me specifically. By my mid-20s, I had developed what I thought was a reasonable strategy for managing Kyle's behavior. I would arrive at family gatherings with minimal belongings, wear clothes I didn't care about too much, and try to position myself away from Kyle during meals and conversations. I told myself that this was just part of having a big blended family, that some personalities clashed, and that the important thing was maintaining peace for Dad and Linda's sake. They seemed so happy together, and I didn't want to be the family member who created drama over what everyone else considered minor accidents and misunderstandings. The escalation that led to the glasses incident began about 6 months before that barbecue in Powell. I had been dating Mark Thompson, a software developer I met through work, for almost a year. Mark was kind, thoughtful, and brought out a confidence in me that I had lost during the years of walking on eggshells around Kyle. For the first time since college, I felt like I was building something meaningful outside my family relationships, something that belonged entirely to me. Mark had met my family several times and had picked up on dynamics that I had trained myself to ignore. After one particularly uncomfortable Sunday dinner, where Kyle had made several cutting remarks about my appearance and work performance, Mark asked me directly if I felt safe around my stepbrother. The question caught me off guard, because I had never framed Kyle's behavior in terms of safety. I had categorized it as annoying, embarrassing, or frustrating, but the idea that I might actually be unsafe had never occurred to me consciously. That conversation with Mark forced me to look more honestly at patterns I had spent years normalizing. I started keeping a mental record of Kyle's accidents and began to notice details I had previously dismissed. His accidents happened more frequently when I seemed happy or confident about something. They occurred more often when Mark was around, as if Kyle was trying to undermine me in front of someone whose opinion mattered to me. The accidents were never serious enough to require medical attention, but they were consistent enough to keep me in a constant state of low-level anxiety whenever Kyle was present. The breaking point came on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in June, when Linda decided to host a family barbecue to celebrate Jake's promotion at the marketing firm where he had been working since college graduation. The gathering was held at a community pavilion in Powell, a suburb north of Columbus, because Linda wanted to invite extended family and several family friends. I was looking forward to the event because Jake and I had developed a genuinely warm relationship over the years, and I was proud of his professional success. I had just gotten new prescription glasses the week before, replacing lenses that had become scratched and outdated. The new glasses were more expensive than I would normally splurge on, but my eye prescription had changed significantly, and I had decided to invest in high-quality frames that would last for years. The lenses were specially coated to reduce glare from computer screens, important for my work as a graphic designer, and the frames were a stylish tortoise-shell pattern that I felt confident wearing both professionally and socially. Mark had come with me to the barbecue, and we were having a wonderful time talking with Jake about his new responsibilities at work and his plans for the future. I was feeling relaxed and happy, enjoying the warm weather and the rare family gathering that seemed to be going smoothly. Kyle had been relatively subdued all afternoon, focused on grilling burgers and hot dogs, and engaged in conversations with Linda's brother and his family, who had driven up from Cincinnati for the celebration. The incident happened so quickly that for a moment I didn't fully process what had occurred. I was standing near the picnic table where desserts were laid out, talking with Mark and Jake about a funny story from Jake's first week in his new position. Kyle approached our group, carrying a plate of food, and seemed to be heading toward the table behind me. As he passed, he reached out and grabbed my glasses directly off my face, not brushing against them or accidentally bumping into me, but grasping them firmly and pulling them away from my head. Before I could react or say anything, Kyle held the glasses up in front of him, made a comment about how thick the lenses were, and then deliberately bent the frames until they snapped in half with a sharp cracking sound. The lenses fell to the ground, one of them shattering completely when it hit the concrete. Kyle immediately started laughing, a loud, genuinely amused laugh that drew the attention of everyone at the pavilion. I stood there in shock, literally unable to see clearly without my glasses, and emotionally stunned by the deliberate cruelty of what had just happened. Mark stepped forward immediately, his voice sharp with anger as he demanded to know what Kyle thought he was doing. Jake looked horrified and started to say something, but Kyle cut him off with continued laughter and an explanation that he was just joking around, that he didn't mean to break them, and that I needed to learn to take a joke instead of being so serious all the time. The family's reaction was swift and predictable, but more painful than I had anticipated even after years of similar incidents. Linda rushed over and immediately began managing the situation, not by addressing Kyle's behavior, but by focusing on damage control and emotional management. She put her arm around me and said in a soothing voice that Kyle obviously felt terrible about the accident, that he had just been trying to tease me in a brotherly way, and that we could get my glasses fixed or replaced easily. Dad approached more slowly, looking uncomfortable and uncertain. When he reached us, he asked Kyle to explain what had happened. Kyle's version of events was that he had been trying to playfully grab my glasses to make a joke about how I always wore them, even outdoors, but that he had accidentally used too much force, and they broke in his hands. He claimed he was absolutely horrified that his harmless prank had gone wrong, and that he would obviously pay to replace my glasses immediately. What happened next was the moment that crystallized years of doubt and frustration into absolute clarity. Linda looked directly at me, her voice firm but not unkind, and said, "Emma, you know Kyle would never hurt you on purpose. Stop being so dramatic about a simple accident." She continued, explaining that Kyle was devastated about what happened, that accidents occur in families, and that the important thing was to handle the situation maturely, rather than making Kyle feel worse than he already did. I looked around at my family members, seeing their faces clearly for the first time despite my blurred vision. Dad was nodding along with Linda's explanation, his expression relieved that she was handling the situation. Jake looked uncomfortable, but remained silent. Extended family members were starting to disperse, clearly wanting to avoid being involved in family drama. Mark stood beside me, his jaw tight with anger, but obviously uncertain about how to intervene in family dynamics he didn't fully understand. In that moment, I realized that no amount of evidence would ever convince my family to see Kyle's behavior for what it was. They had invested 8 years in maintaining the narrative that Kyle was a good person who occasionally had accidents around me, and they would continue to protect that narrative regardless of what actually happened. I was expected to absorb Kyle's hostility, minimize the impact of his actions, and prioritize family harmony over my own physical and emotional safety. Instead of arguing or trying to convince anyone of what I had clearly experienced, I calmly asked Mark to drive me home. I told Linda and Dad that I would talk to them later, picked up the broken pieces of my glasses from the ground, and walked to Mark's car without saying another word. The drive back to Columbus was quiet, both of us processing what had just occurred, and what it meant for my relationship with my family going forward. That evening, as I sat in my apartment trying to work on my laptop without my glasses, and dealing with the headache that always came from eye strain, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of replacing my glasses through my usual optometrist near my apartment, I decided to get a comprehensive eye exam and document exactly what had happened to my previous glasses. I wanted a professional assessment of the damage, not just for insurance purposes, but because I needed objective verification of what I had experienced. Monday morning, I called Morrison Eye Care Center, a practice I had researched specifically, because they had excellent reviews for thoroughness and attention to detail. I explained to the receptionist that I needed an emergency appointment because my glasses had been broken and I was having difficulty functioning without them. She was able to fit me in that afternoon, with Dr. Michael Chen, the practice's senior optometrist. Dr. Chen turned out to be exactly the kind of medical professional I had hoped to find. He was methodical, observant, and genuinely concerned about both my immediate vision needs and the circumstances that had led to my appointment. When I brought in the broken glasses and explained that they had been damaged at a family gathering, he examined the frames and lenses carefully before asking detailed questions about how the damage had occurred. I found myself telling Dr. Chen the truth about what had happened, not just the sanitized version I had been expected to accept, but the actual sequence of events as I had experienced them. He listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the force involved, the angle at which the frames had been bent, and whether I had experienced any physical discomfort when the glasses were removed from my face. After completing my eye exam and ordering new glasses, Dr. Chen spent additional time examining the broken frames under magnification. He took photographs of the damage and asked if I would like him to document his findings in a detailed report. When I said yes, he explained that the pattern of damage was inconsistent with accidental breakage, and that the force required to snap frames in that particular way would have been deliberate and significant. 3 days later, I received Dr. Chen's report in the mail, and reading it was like seeing my experience validated by an objective professional for the first time in 8 years. The report detailed the specific type of force required to create the damage pattern on my glasses, noted that the breakage was consistent with deliberate bending, rather than accidental impact, and included photographs showing the precise points where the frames had been compromised. Most importantly, Dr. Chen had documented that this type of damage would have required intentional application of force, and could not have occurred through any reasonable accident or mishap. Holding that report in my hands, I finally had concrete evidence that my perception of Kyle's behavior had been accurate all along. I wasn't oversensitive, dramatic, or misinterpreting innocent accidents. I had been the target of deliberate, calculated cruelty for 8 years, and my family had chosen to protect my abuser, rather than acknowledge what was happening to me. The question now was what I intended to do with this validation, and how I was going to protect myself going forward in a family system that had repeatedly chosen Kyle's comfort over my safety. The validation I felt from Dr. Chen's report was immediately followed by a crushing realization about how isolated I had become in my own family. For 8 years, I had been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was too sensitive, or reading malice into innocent interactions. Now I had professional documentation, proving that Kyle's latest attack on me had been deliberate and calculated. Yet I knew that presenting this evidence to my family would likely result in more gaslighting and manipulation, rather than accountability. I spent the week after receiving the report in a strange emotional limbo. At work, I threw myself into client projects with renewed focus, grateful for the distraction of creative challenges that had clear solutions. My colleagues at Creative Solutions Agency noticed my improved mood and attributed it to my new glasses, which had arrived with impressive speed, thanks to Dr. Chen's detailed prescription notes. What they couldn't see was the weight I carried, knowing that I finally had proof of something I had suspected for years, but been unable to articulate clearly. Mark had been incredibly supportive throughout the entire ordeal, but I could sense his growing frustration with my family's dynamic. He had witnessed Kyle's behavior firsthand at the barbecue, and couldn't understand how adults could dismiss such obvious cruelty as an accident. When I showed him Dr. Chen's report, his reaction was immediate and intense. He wanted me to confront Kyle directly, to show the report to my father and stepmother, and to demand that they acknowledge what had really happened. His anger on my behalf was validating, but it also highlighted how differently we approached conflict resolution. Mark came from a family where problems were addressed directly and honestly. When his siblings disagreed, they argued openly, resolved their differences, and moved on without carrying grudges or resentment. The idea of enduring years of passive-aggressive abuse, while maintaining a facade of family harmony, was completely foreign to his experience. He couldn't understand why I hesitated to use Dr. Chen's report as ammunition against Kyle, or why I seemed more anxious than relieved to have concrete evidence of what I had endured. The truth was that I knew my family well enough to predict their response to any confrontation. Regardless of how much documentation I provided, Linda would find ways to minimize the significance of Dr. Chen's findings, suggesting that even if Kyle had used more force than necessary, his intentions had still been playful, rather than malicious. Dad would be uncomfortable with the conflict, and would encourage everyone to move past the incident for the sake of family unity. Kyle himself would probably admit to being rougher than intended, while maintaining that he never meant to hurt me, painting himself as the victim of my oversensitivity and Mark's influence. What I wasn't prepared for was how quickly my family would escalate their manipulation tactics when they sensed that I was pulling away from their narrative. 3 days after I received Dr. Chen's report, Linda called me at work, something she had never done in all the years I had known her. Her voice was bright and cheerful, as she explained that she was organizing a family dinner to celebrate Jake's continued success at his new job, and to give everyone a chance to spend quality time together after the unfortunate incident at the barbecue. The timing of this dinner invitation was clearly calculated to put me in an impossible position. Declining would be seen as confirmation that I was holding grudges and refusing to participate in family healing. Attending would signal that I was willing to pretend nothing significant had happened, and return to the status quo of absorbing Kyle's behavior without complaint. Linda's cheerful tone made it clear that she expected me to choose family harmony over my own feelings, just as I always had before. I told Linda that I needed to check my schedule, and would get back to her, buying myself time to think through my options. That evening, Mark and I had a long conversation about what my family's behavior meant for our future together. He had been patient and supportive, but he was struggling to understand how I could continue participating in family relationships that were clearly harmful to my well-being. For the first time, he directly asked me whether I was willing to establish boundaries with my family, or if I intended to accept their treatment indefinitely. The question forced me to confront something I had been avoiding. I realized that I had been hoping for years that my family would eventually recognize Kyle's behavior and validate my experiences without any action on my
part. I had been waiting for them to become different people rather than accepting who they actually were and making decisions based on that reality. Mark's patience and support had shown me what healthy relationships looked like, but that knowledge made it even more painful to return to family dynamics where I was expected to minimize my own needs and experiences. When I called Linda back 2 days later to decline the dinner invitation, her response revealed the manipulation tactics I had been unconsciously navigating for years. Her cheerful facade disappeared immediately, replaced by a tone of wounded disappointment. She told me that Dad was devastated by my refusal to participate in family healing, that Kyle had been beating himself up about the accident all week, and that my unwillingness to move forward was creating unnecessary stress for everyone involved. Linda then shifted to what she probably considered a more persuasive approach, explaining that families sometimes went through difficult periods but that love and commitment, working through challenges together rather than running away from them. She reminded me of everything Dad had done for me over the years, how he had supported me through college and helped me get established in my career. She suggested that my recent behavior was influenced by Mark, who didn't understand our family dynamics and was encouraging me to create conflict where none had existed before. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, with Linda cycling through guilt, disappointment, and subtle threats about the consequences of my choices. She mentioned that Dad's health hadn't been great lately, and that stress from family conflict could exacerbate his blood pressure problems. She wondered aloud whether my job was creating too much stress, making me less able to handle normal family interactions with appropriate perspective. By the end of the call, she had managed to plant seeds of doubt about my judgment, my relationship with Mark, and my loyalty to my father. That night, I lay awake processing the conversation and recognizing manipulation tactics I had been responding to unconsciously for years. Linda's ability to make me feel guilty for having boundaries, her suggestion that my perceptions were influenced by outside forces, and her implications that my choices were somehow damaging my father's health, were all strategies designed to maintain a family system where Kyle's behavior was never questioned, and my responses were always the problem. The next morning, I made an appointment with Carol Mitchell, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and boundaries. I had been considering therapy for months, but the conversation with Linda crystallized my need for professional support in understanding and responding to my family dynamics. Dr. Mitchell had excellent reviews and experience working with adults who had grown up in households where gaslighting and emotional manipulation were normalized. My first session with Dr. Mitchell was simultaneously relieving and overwhelming. She listened to my description of Kyle's behavior and my family's responses with the kind of focused attention I had never received from my family members. When I showed her Dr. Chen's report, she immediately recognized its significance, not just as documentation of a specific incident, but as validation of a pattern of abuse that had been systematically denied and minimized by the adults who should have protected me. Dr. Mitchell helped me understand that what I had experienced was a form of psychological abuse called scapegoating, where one family member becomes the target for dysfunction and aggression, while other family members maintain their equilibrium by denying or minimizing the abuse. Kyle's behavior toward me served a function in our family system, allowing everyone else to feel good about themselves by comparison and giving them a shared focus for managing their own discomfort with conflict. The revelation that my experience had a name and was recognized by mental health professionals as a legitimate form of abuse was both validating and devastating. I felt relieved to know that my perceptions had been accurate and that my emotional responses were normal reactions to abnormal treatment. At the same time, I grieved for the years I had spent questioning my own reality and trying to earn love and respect from people who were never going to provide them. Dr. Mitchell introduced me to the concept of trauma bonding, explaining how repeated cycles of abuse followed by reconciliation attempts create powerful psychological attachments that are difficult to break. She helped me understand why I continued to hope for my family's validation despite overwhelming evidence that it would never come, and why the idea of establishing firm boundaries felt simultaneously necessary and terrifying. Over the following weeks, Linda continued calling with increasingly urgent requests for family reconciliation. She organized another dinner, this time framing it as an opportunity for Kyle to formally apologize for the glasses incident. When I declined, she suggested a smaller gathering with just Dad, her, and me. When I declined that as well, she proposed meeting for coffee to discuss our communication issues and find ways to move forward as a family. Each invitation was accompanied by escalating emotional manipulation. Linda began calling Mark directly, explaining that she was worried about my mental health and asking him to encourage me to seek professional help for what she described as my growing paranoia and inability to forgive innocent mistakes. She contacted my boss at Creative Solutions Agency, ostensibly to plan a surprise birthday celebration for me, but actually to fish for information about whether my work performance had declined due to family stress. The most disturbing escalation came when Linda showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Saturday morning, claiming that Dad was sick and needed to see me urgently. When I called Dad directly from my doorway, while Linda stood in the hallway, he confirmed that he was fine and had no idea why Linda would suggest otherwise. Her lie was so blatant and easily disproven that it marked a turning point in my understanding of how far she was willing to go to maintain control over family narratives. Dr. Mitchell helped me recognize that Linda's escalating behavior was a predictable response to my withdrawal from the family system. As long as I participated in family gatherings and absorbed Kyle's abuse without meaningful resistance, the system remained stable and everyone could maintain their comfortable roles. My refusal to continue participating threatened that stability and triggered increasingly desperate attempts to pull me back into compliance. Meanwhile, my relationship with Mark was deepening in ways that highlighted the stark contrast between healthy and unhealthy relationship dynamics. Mark consistently respected my boundaries, supported my decision-making process without trying to control the outcomes, and provided emotional validation without requiring me to minimize my experiences in return. His family welcomed me warmly, treating me as an individual worthy of respect, rather than as a problem to be managed or a role to be filled. The difference was most apparent during a weekend visit to Mark's parents' house in Dayton. His mother, Patricia, was preparing dinner when she accidentally knocked over a glass of wine, staining the tablecloth and breaking the glass. Instead of blaming anyone else or creating drama around the incident, Patricia simply cleaned up the mess, laughed about her clumsiness, and continued with dinner preparations. When Mark joked that she was getting old and needed to be more careful, Patricia playfully threw a dish towel at him, and everyone laughed together. Watching this interaction, I realized that I had never experienced casual, affectionate teasing that didn't carry an undercurrent of cruelty or power imbalance. In Mark's family, jokes were genuinely funny rather than disguised attacks, accidents were handled matter-of-factly without blame or manipulation, and conflicts were resolved through direct communication rather than passive-aggressive punishment. The ease and warmth of their interactions showed me what I had been missing and made it even more difficult to tolerate my own family's dysfunction. The final catalyst for my decision to completely separate from my family came during what Linda positioned as a last-ditch effort at reconciliation. She called me at work on a Thursday afternoon, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion as she explained that Dad had been diagnosed with early-stage heart disease and needed surgery within the next month. She said that Dad was scared about the procedure and that his one wish was to have his family together and supportive during this difficult time. The news about Dad's health was genuinely alarming, and Linda's emotional appeal triggered every guilt response she had trimmed into me over the years. Despite my growing understanding of her manipulation tactics, I felt immediate anxiety about Dad's well-being and responsibility for providing him emotional support during a medical crisis. I agreed to meet with Linda and Dad the following Sunday to discuss how I could be involved in his care during the surgery and recovery period. When I arrived at their house in Grandview Heights that Sunday, I found not just Dad and Linda waiting for me, but Kyle and Jake as well. Linda had orchestrated what she probably saw as an intervention, bringing together all the family members to address what she described as our communication breakdown and my recent withdrawal from family activities. The ambush nature of the gathering should have been my cue to leave immediately, but my concern for Dad's health overrode my instincts for self-protection. Dad did look tired and stressed, though whether from heart problems or family tension was difficult to determine. He seemed genuinely happy to see me, and gave me the kind of warm hug I remembered from childhood, before Linda and Kyle had become central figures in our family dynamic. For a moment, I felt hopeful that we might be able to have an honest conversation about boundaries and respect without the manipulation and gaslighting that had characterized our recent interactions. That hope was quickly destroyed when Linda took control of the conversation, framing the gathering as an opportunity for everyone to clear the air and commit to better communication going forward. She started by acknowledging that there had been misunderstandings and hurt feelings on all sides, but emphasized that family meant working through difficulties rather than allowing them to create permanent divisions. Her tone was reasonable and conciliatory, but her framing immediately positioned me as an equal participant in creating problems rather than as the target of Kyle's abuse. Kyle's contribution to this family meeting was a masterpiece of manipulation disguised as accountability. He acknowledged that his behavior at the barbecue had been inappropriate, admitted that he sometimes didn't think before acting, and apologized for any hurt feelings his actions had caused. However, his apology was carefully worded to avoid admitting deliberate cruelty while positioning himself as someone who occasionally made social mistakes, rather than someone who had systematically targeted me for abuse. Most significantly, Kyle expressed confusion and hurt about my recent withdrawal from family activities, suggesting that my refusal to accept his apology was creating unnecessary drama and stress for Dad during an already difficult time. He wondered aloud whether I was getting bad advice from outside sources about how to handle family relationships, and suggested that my job stress might be making me less able to handle normal family interactions with appropriate perspective. The gaslighting was so subtle and skillful that I might have been swayed by it, if not for Dr. Mitchell's education about manipulation tactics and Dr. Chen's report sitting in my purse as concrete evidence of Kyle's deliberate violence. Instead of defending myself or trying to convince them of what I had experienced, I simply listened and observed, noting how each family member contributed to a narrative where my perceptions were questionable and my boundaries were problematic. When it was my turn to speak, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of engaging in the usual cycle of explanation and justification, I calmly stated that I appreciated their concern, but that I needed to focus on my own well-being, and wouldn't be participating in family gatherings for the foreseeable future. I told Dad that I loved him and would be happy to support him through his medical treatment in ways that didn't involve Kyle, but that I was no longer willing to pretend that Kyle's behavior toward me had been accidental or acceptable. The reaction was immediate and intense. Linda accused me of being selfish and manipulative, choosing to create family drama during Dad's health crisis for attention and control. Kyle expressed hurt and confusion, claiming that he had apologized sincerely and couldn't understand why I was determined to hold grudges instead of moving forward like a mature adult. Dad looked devastated and asked whether there was anything he could do to help me feel more comfortable at family gatherings, suggesting that maybe Kyle and I just needed to avoid each other during visits. The most painful part was seeing how my family members rallied around Kyle, treating him as the injured party who needed protection from my unreasonable expectations and accusations. Even Jake, who had witnessed Kyle's behavior over the years and sometimes seemed uncomfortable with it, supported the family narrative that I was overreacting to innocent mistakes and creating unnecessary conflict through my refusal to forgive and forget. I left that gathering with absolute clarity about my family's priorities and capabilities. They were never going to acknowledge Kyle's abuse or validate my experiences, because doing so would require them to admit their own complicity in enabling his behavior. It was easier and more comfortable for them to position me as the problem, the family member who was too sensitive, too dramatic, and too influenced by outside forces to participate appropriately in family relationships. That night, I called Mark and told him that I was ready to make a clean break from my family system. The conversation was both relieving and terrifying, because it meant acknowledging that the people I had spent my life trying to please and win over were never going to provide the love and respect I deserved. It also meant accepting that my future would be built around chosen relationships rather than biological obligations, and that I would have to create my own sense of family and belonging. The next morning, I called Dr. Mitchell and scheduled an emergency session to process what had happened and plan my next steps. She helped me understand that my family's reaction was entirely predictable, and that my decision to prioritize my own well-being over their comfort was healthy and necessary. She also warned me that my family's manipulation attempts would likely escalate before they accepted my boundaries, and helped me prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. Over the following days, I began the practical work of separating myself from family obligations and expectations. I blocked Linda's number after she left 17 voicemails in a single afternoon, all expressing various combinations of disappointment, concern, and anger about my decision to abandon Dad during his medical crisis. I stopped responding to texts from Kyle that alternated between fake apologies and accusations that I was tearing the family apart for attention. The most difficult part was managing my relationship with Dad, who seemed genuinely confused and hurt by my decision to establish boundaries. He called several times asking if we could meet privately to discuss what had happened and whether there was anything he could do to help me feel more comfortable with family gatherings. His calls were the hardest to ignore because his concern seemed genuine rather than manipulative, but I knew that any private meeting would inevitably become another opportunity for him to encourage me to forgive Kyle and return to family activities for the sake of peace. Instead of meeting with Dad in person, I wrote him a detailed letter explaining my decision and my hopes for maintaining a relationship with him that didn't involve Kyle or Linda. I included a copy of Dr. Chen's report, hoping that concrete medical documentation might help him understand that Kyle's behavior toward me had been deliberately harmful rather than accidentally problematic. I also explained that my decision wasn't motivated by anger or revenge, but by a need to protect my own mental health and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. Dad's response came in the form of a phone call 2 days after he received my letter. His voice was strained and emotional as he told me that he had read Dr. Chen's report and understood that Kyle's behavior at the barbecue had been more serious than he had initially realized. He acknowledged that there might have been other incidents over the years that he had dismissed too quickly, and said that he wanted to find ways to support me while also maintaining his marriage and family relationships. For a moment I felt hopeful that Dad might be capable of seeing the situation more clearly and supporting my need for boundaries. However, his proposed solution revealed that he still didn't fully understand the extent of the problem or the changes that would be necessary to protect me from further abuse. He suggested that Kyle could attend family gatherings, but would be required to stay on the opposite side of the room from me, and that Linda could help monitor their interactions to prevent any more accidents or misunderstandings. The suggestion that Kyle and I could coexist safely at family gatherings, with careful supervision, showed that Dad still saw this as a conflict between two family members who needed to find better ways to get along, rather than recognizing it as a pattern of abuse that required Kyle's complete removal from my life. His willingness to ask Kyle to modify his behavior slightly, but his unwillingness to consider excluding Kyle from gatherings entirely, made it clear that maintaining family unity was still his priority over ensuring my safety and well-being. The decision to completely cut contact with my family crystallized on a Wednesday evening in late July, when Linda showed up at my workplace just before closing time. I was finishing up a logo design for a new restaurant client when our receptionist, Melissa, knocked on my office door to tell me that my stepmother was in the lobby asking to speak with me urgently. The fact that Linda had tracked down my exact office location and was willing to create a scene at my professional workplace marked a new level of escalation that I couldn't ignore or minimize. I found Linda pacing in our lobby, her usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled, and her voice carrying the sharp edge of barely controlled panic. She launched into an immediate explanation about how Dad's surgery had been moved up to the following week due to a cancellation, and how the doctors had discovered additional complications that made the procedure more serious than originally anticipated. According to Linda, Dad was asking for me specifically and had been unable to sleep or eat properly because of his worry that I wouldn't be there to support him during the most frightening experience of his life. The emotional manipulation was expertly crafted to target every guilt trigger Linda had identified over the years of our relationship. She knew that my love for Dad was genuine, and that my concern for his health was one of the few things that could override my instinct for self-preservation. She also knew that creating a scene at my workplace would embarrass me professionally and pressure me to agree to her demands quickly rather than risk having my colleagues witness family drama. However, instead of feeling the usual crushing guilt and immediate compliance that Linda expected, I felt a strange detachment as I watched her performance. Dr. Mitchell's education about manipulation tactics had given me a framework for understanding what was happening, and I could see Linda's strategy with startling clarity. Every tear, every trembling voice inflection, every reference to Dad's fear and vulnerability was calculated to bypass my rational decision-making and trigger my trained responses to family crisis. I told Linda that I would call Dad directly to discuss his surgery and arrange appropriate support that didn't involve family gatherings or interactions with Kyle. Her response revealed the desperation behind her carefully constructed facade. She immediately shifted from wounded concern to barely contained anger, telling me that Dad was too upset to handle direct communication about my refusal to participate in family support, and that my selfishness was literally making him sicker. When I remained calm and repeated that I would contact Dad myself, Linda's mask slipped completely. She accused me of being brainwashed by Mark, of allowing an outsider to destroy family relationships that had taken years to build, and of using Dad's medical crisis as an opportunity to hurt everyone who had ever loved me. Her voice rose loud enough that several of my colleagues stopped their conversations to stare, and I realized that Linda's willingness to create a public scene was evidence of how desperate she had become to regain control over my participation in family dynamics. I escorted Linda to the elevator and told her that any future communication would need to go through email rather than phone calls or workplace visits. Her parting words were a threat disguised as concern, warning me that my behavior was going to result in consequences I couldn't imagine, and that I would regret my choices for the rest of my life. The elevator doors closed on her furious face, and I returned to my office shaking with adrenaline, and the recognition that my family's manipulation tactics had escalated beyond anything I could manage while maintaining any relationship with them. That evening, I called Dad from my apartment, expecting to have an honest conversation about his surgery and my willingness to support him in ways that didn't compromise my safety or well-being. Instead, I discovered that Linda had been lying about almost every detail of his medical situation. Dad's surgery was scheduled for the original date 3 weeks away, not moved up to the following week. The procedure was routine cardiac catheterization, not the major operation Linda had described. Most importantly, Dad had never asked for me specifically, or expressed any distress about my absence from family gatherings. The conversation with Dad was heartbreaking in ways I hadn't anticipated. When I described Linda's visit to my workplace and the crisis she had described, Dad was genuinely confused and upset to learn that she had been using his medical situation to manipulate me. He assured me that while he would certainly appreciate my support during his procedure, he understood my need for boundaries and had never expected or demanded my participation in family activities that made me uncomfortable. However, Dad's response to learning about Linda's lies was more telling than his medical situation. Instead of expressing anger about her manipulation or concern about the escalating harassment I was experiencing, Dad seemed primarily worried about how this revelation would affect his marriage. He made excuses for Linda's behavior, suggesting that she was under tremendous stress about his health and was probably acting out of genuine concern rather than malicious intent. Dad's willingness to minimize Linda's lies and manipulation, even when they directly involved my professional reputation and emotional well-being, confirmed that he would never be able to provide the protection and support I needed to maintain a relationship with him. His loyalty to his marriage would always supersede his concern for my safety, and any relationship with him would inevitably involve exposure to Linda's escalating attempts to control and punish me. That night, I made the most difficult decision of my adult life. I would cut all contact with my family, not just limiting interactions or setting boundaries, but completely disappearing from their lives, until they learned to respect my autonomy and treat me with basic human dignity. The decision felt simultaneously liberating and devastating, like choosing to amputate a limb that had become infected beyond the possibility of healing. Mark's support during this period was unwavering and crucial to my ability to follow through on such a drastic decision. He helped me understand that protecting myself from abuse wasn't selfish or dramatic, but necessary and healthy. He also offered practical assistance with the logistics of disappearing from family contact, drawing on his background in software development to help me secure my digital privacy and create barriers that would prevent unwanted contact. The first step was changing my phone number and email address, providing the new contact information only to Mark, Dr. Mitchell, and a few close friends who understood the situation and could be trusted not to share information with my family. I updated my emergency contacts at work and with my medical providers, removing all family members and replacing them with Mark and Jessica Wright, my closest friend from college who had moved to Columbus for graduate school. I also took steps to protect my physical safety and privacy, changing the locks on my apartment and installing a security system that would alert me to any unexpected visitors. Linda's willingness to show up at my workplace had demonstrated that she was capable of escalating to stalking behavior, and I wanted to ensure that my home remained a safe space where I could relax without constantly watching for ambush confrontations. The financial aspects of separating from my family were surprisingly complex, despite the fact that I had been financially independent for years. Dad had been listed as a beneficiary on my life insurance policy through work, and Linda had access to information about my medical care through our shared family physician. Untangling these connections required several days of phone calls and paperwork, but each severed tie felt like reclaiming a piece of my autonomy that I hadn't realized was compromised. The most challenging aspect of disappearing from my family's life was managing my own emotional responses to the decision. Despite years of abuse and manipulation, I had genuine love for Dad and even some affection for Jake, who had never participated in Kyle's cruelty but had also never intervened to protect me. Cutting contact with people I cared about felt like a profound loss, even though I intellectually understood that it was necessary for my well-being. Dr. Mitchell helped me process the grief that accompanied my decision, explaining that it was normal and healthy to mourn the loss of family relationships, even when those relationships were harmful. She helped me understand that my sadness about losing contact with Dad didn't mean my decision was wrong, but rather reflected the complexity of loving someone who was unable or unwilling to protect me from harm. The grief was complicated by periods of intense relief and freedom that felt almost euphoric compared to the constant
anxiety I had carried for years, without the need to monitor Kyle's behavior, anticipate family drama, or manage Linda's emotional manipulation. I discovered mental and emotional energy that I had forgotten I possessed. Colors seemed brighter, food tasted better, and I found myself laughing more easily than I had in years. My relationship with Mark deepened significantly during this period, as he became my primary emotional support and the person who witnessed my transformations from anxious people-pleaser to confident advocate for my own needs. He was patient with my occasional doubts about my decision and my tendency to second-guess myself when family manipulation had been my normal experience for so long. His consistent respect for my boundaries and validation of my experiences provided a model for healthy relationship dynamics that I used as a reference point for rebuilding my sense of self-worth. Work became another source of healing and growth, as I threw myself into creative projects with renewed enthusiasm and confidence. Without the constant drain of family stress, I found that I had more energy for innovative thinking and risk-taking in my design work. My supervisor, Brian Foster, noticed the improvement in my performance and creativity, leading to more challenging assignments and recognition within the agency. The absence of family obligations also freed up time and emotional resources for developing friendships and interests that reflected my authentic personality rather than my trained role as family peacekeeper. I joined a hiking club that explored trails throughout Ohio and neighboring states, discovering a love for outdoor adventure that I had never had the mental space to pursue. The physical challenge of hiking and the beauty of natural landscapes provided a form of meditation that helped me process the emotional work of healing from family trauma. 3 weeks after I had last spoken to any family member, Linda began a campaign of indirect contact that revealed both her desperation and her unwillingness to respect my clearly stated boundaries. Since I had blocked her direct access to my phone and email, she started reaching out to my workplace, my friends, and even my landlord with various fabricated emergencies designed to force me to contact her. The first incident involved Linda calling Creative Solutions Agency to report that I was missing and that she needed to speak with me urgently about a family emergency. Fortunately, I had already briefed Brian Foster about the possibility of family members attempting to create workplace drama, and he handled Linda's call professionally while refusing to provide any information about my schedule or availability. However, the fact that Linda was willing to involve my employer in her manipulation attempts demonstrated that her harassment would likely escalate rather than diminish over time. Jessica Wright received multiple calls from Linda claiming to be concerned about my mental health and asking for help organizing an intervention to address what Linda described as my dangerous isolation and paranoid behavior. Jessica, who had witnessed years of my family's manipulation and had strongly supported my decision to establish boundaries, refused to participate in Linda's schemes and threatened to involve law enforcement if the harassment continued. The most disturbing incident occurred when Linda contacted my landlord claiming to be my emergency contact and reporting that I hadn't been seen or heard from in several days. She convinced him to do a wellness check by entering my apartment while I was at work, ostensibly to ensure that I hadn't suffered a medical emergency or mental health crisis. I returned home to find that someone had been in my apartment, with subtle signs that my personal belongings had been searched and my living space had been invaded. When I confronted my landlord about the unauthorized entry, he was apologetic but explained that Linda had been very convincing about her concern for my safety and had provided enough personal information about me to seem like a legitimate family contact.
The violation of my home privacy was deeply disturbing, but it also provided clear evidence that Linda's behavior had crossed into criminal territory and that legal intervention might be necessary to protect myself. I filed a police report about the unauthorized entry and obtained a restraining order against Linda, Kyle, and any other family members who might participate in harassment or stalking behavior. The process of documenting their escalating manipulation attempts was emotionally exhausting, but it also provided official validation that my concerns about their behavior were legitimate and serious. The restraining order seemed to reduce the frequency of direct harassment attempts, but it also triggered a new phase of indirect manipulation through mutual acquaintances and community connections. Linda began spreading stories about my mental health and the tragic breakdown of our previously close family relationship, positioning herself as the grieving stepmother whose efforts to help her troubled stepdaughter had been rejected and misunderstood. These indirect attacks on my reputation were particularly painful because they targeted my professional and social connections in Columbus, potentially damaging relationships that were important to my career and personal life. Linda's version of events portrayed me as unstable and vindictive, someone who had abandoned her loving family during a medical crisis because of paranoid delusions and outside influence from a manipulative boyfriend. The campaign was sophisticated enough that some people who didn't know me well began to question whether Linda's concerns about my mental health might be legitimate. A few acquaintances approached Mark with gentle suggestions that I might benefit from professional help for what they described as my obvious distress and social isolation. The fact that Linda was able to make me seem like the problem rather than the victim demonstrated her skill at manipulation and her understanding of how to weaponize community concern. Dr. Mitchell helped me understand that Linda's public relations campaign was a predictable response to losing control over me, and that the best strategy was to maintain my boundaries while building authentic relationships with people who could see through the manipulation. She encouraged me to focus on demonstrating my stability and well-being through my actions rather than trying to defend myself against Linda's accusations directly. The process of rebuilding my reputation and social connections was slow but ultimately rewarding, as it forced me to develop genuine friendships based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than family obligations or social convenience. The people who took time to get to know me personally rather than accepting Linda's characterizations became valuable allies and supporters who understood the reality of my situation. During this period, I also began to understand how my family's dysfunction had affected my ability to form healthy relationships throughout my life. Dr. Mitchell helped me recognize patterns of people-pleasing, conflict avoidance, and self-doubt that had developed as survival strategies in my family but were counterproductive in healthy relationships. Learning to trust my own perceptions, express my needs directly, and maintain boundaries without guilt were skills I had to develop consciously as an adult. The work of healing from family trauma was complicated by the fact that I had no clear memories of a time when my family relationships had been healthy and supportive. Unlike people who experienced a clear before and after trauma, my dysfunction had been gradual and normalized over many years, making it difficult to distinguish between authentic personality traits and learned responses to abuse. Mark's patience during this period of self-discovery was extraordinary, as he supported my efforts to figure out who I was outside of my family role while dealing with his own frustration about their continued harassment attempts. He encouraged me to pursue interests and activities that felt authentic to me, even when they were completely different from anything I had enjoyed before. His unwavering belief in my worth and potential provided a stable foundation for the experimental process of building a new identity. 6 months after cutting contact with my family, I received the first communication that suggested any possibility of accountability or change. Jake called my old phone number and left a voicemail that was forwarded to me through a mutual friend who still maintained relationships with both sides of the family conflict. His message was brief and carefully worded, expressing regret about how family relationships had deteriorated and asking if there was any possibility of private communication between us. Jake's outreach was significant because he had been the one family member who had never participated directly in Kyle's abuse or Linda's manipulation, though he had also never intervened to protect me. His willingness to contact me despite family pressure suggested that he might be capable of seeing the situation more clearly than other family members, or at least willing to maintain a relationship with me independent of family politics. However, I was cautious about responding to Jake's message because I understood that family members often served as flying monkeys, gathering information for the primary abusers or attempting to guilt me into returning to contact. Dr. Mitchell helped me think through the potential benefits and risks of limited communication with Jake, emphasizing the importance of maintaining clear boundaries and being prepared to cut contact again if he proved unable to respect my autonomy. After considerable thought, I decided to respond to Jake with a carefully worded email explaining my position and outlining the conditions that would be necessary for any ongoing relationship. I made it clear that I had no intention of returning to family gatherings or resuming contact with Kyle or Linda, but that I was open to building an independent relationship with him if he could respect those boundaries. Jake's response was more thoughtful and accountable than I had expected, acknowledging that he had witnessed concerning behavior over the years but had convinced himself that it wasn't his place to intervene in relationships between other family members. He expressed genuine remorse for not speaking up when he saw me being mistreated and admitted that he had been more focused on avoiding conflict than protecting someone who was clearly being targeted for abuse. Most importantly, Jake made no attempts to convince me to reconcile with other family members or to suggest that my boundaries were excessive or unnecessary. He seemed to understand that my decision to cut contact was a response to serious mistreatment rather than a temporary emotional reaction that would eventually resolve itself with time and family pressure. The cautious rebuilding of my relationship with Jake became a testing ground for my ability to maintain boundaries while remaining open to genuine connection. He proved capable of respecting my limits and building a relationship that didn't involve sharing information with other family members or pressuring me to change my position about contact with Kyle and Linda. Through Jake, I learned that my disappearance had created significant upheaval in my family's dynamics, forcing them to confront the consequences of their treatment of me and find new ways to manage their relationships without using me as a scapegoat or emotional regulator. Kyle had apparently struggled with depression and anger about what he described as my abandonment of the family, though Jake noted that Kyle seemed unable to connect his own behavior to my decision to leave. Linda had become increasingly isolated as her manipulation tactics became more obvious to extended family and friends who had witnessed her escalating harassment attempts. Her efforts to portray herself as the victim of my mental health issues had backfired when several people pointed out that her behavior toward me seemed more concerning than my efforts to protect myself from it. Dad's response to my absence was the most complex, involving genuine grief about losing his relationship with me combined with continued loyalty to his marriage and unwillingness to hold Linda accountable for her role in driving me away. Jake described him as confused and hurt, unable to understand how family relationships had deteriorated so severely, but also unable or unwilling to make the changes that would be necessary to rebuild trust with me. The information Jake shared helped me understand that my family was experiencing real consequences for their treatment of me, but it also confirmed that none of them were taking genuine responsibility for their behavior or making meaningful changes that would justify my return to contact. They seemed to view my absence as a punishment they were enduring rather than a natural consequence of their choices, and their focus remained on finding ways to convince me to return rather than addressing the underlying issues that had made my departure necessary. As my first year of no contact with most of my family progressed, I began to see dramatic improvements in every area of my life. My career advanced significantly, with a promotion to senior designer and the opportunity to lead major client projects that challenged my creative abilities and showcased my professional skills. My relationship with Mark continued to deepen, with discussions about marriage and shared future goals that felt grounded in mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than emotional neediness or escape from family dysfunction. Most importantly, I discovered parts of my personality and interests that had been suppressed or hidden during years of family stress and hypervigilance. Without the constant need to monitor Kyle's behavior and manage family drama, I found that I was naturally more outgoing, creative, and confident than I had ever realized. The person I became during that year of healing felt more authentic and energetic than any version of myself I could remember from my life before cutting family contact. 2 years after I completely disappeared from my family's life, I received a phone call that would test everything I had learned about boundaries, forgiveness, and the possibility of genuine change. Mark and I were celebrating our engagement at a quiet restaurant in Portland, Oregon, where we had relocated 6 months earlier for his new position with a tech startup and my opportunity to join a prestigious design firm specializing in sustainable branding. The move to the Pacific Northwest had been the final step in creating a life that was entirely our own, free from the geographic reminders of family trauma and the possibility of unwanted encounters. The call came from Jake, whose relationship with me had evolved into something resembling normal sibling affection over the 18 months of careful boundaried contact we had maintained. His voice was strained and uncertain as he explained that Kyle had been in a serious car accident 2 days earlier and was currently in intensive care at Riverside Methodist Hospital in Columbus. According to Jake, Kyle had been driving under the influence when he crashed his truck into a tree, suffering multiple injuries including a traumatic brain injury that had left him in a medically induced coma. The news of Kyle's accident triggered a complex mix of emotions that surprised me with their intensity. Despite everything Kyle had done to me over the years, I felt genuine sadness about his suffering and concern for the fear and pain his family must be experiencing. At the same time, I felt guilty about my own relief that Kyle's capacity to hurt anyone was temporarily eliminated, and confused about whether his condition created any obligation for me to resume contact with my family. Jake's call was not a demand or manipulation attempt, but rather an informational update delivered with respect for my autonomy and understanding of why I might choose not to act on the information. He made it clear that he wasn't asking me to visit the hospital or contact other family members, but felt I should know what had happened in case I heard about it through other channels or decided I wanted to be involved in some way. The conversation revealed that my absence from family dynamics had continued to create ripple effects throughout the 2 years since I had disappeared. Kyle's depression and anger about what he perceived as my betrayal had apparently escalated into increasingly self-destructive behavior, including heavy drinking and reckless driving that had culminated in the accident. Linda's manipulation and control tactics had become more obvious to extended family as her primary target was no longer available to absorb her dysfunction, leading to strained relationships with relatives who began to see her behavior more clearly. Most significantly, Dad had apparently been struggling with his own guilt and confusion about his role in enabling the family dynamics that had driven me away. According to Jake, Dad had started attending therapy sessions focused on understanding family dysfunction and his own patterns of conflict avoidance that had allowed Kyle's abuse to continue unchecked for years. The work was difficult and painful, forcing Dad to confront uncomfortable truths about his marriage and his failures to protect me from harm. Jake's update about Dad's therapy was the most hopeful information I had received about any family member since cutting contact, but I remained cautious about interpreting it as evidence of genuine change. I had learned through Dr. Mitchell's guidance that crisis situations often motivate temporary behavioral modifications that don't represent lasting transformation, and that family members in therapy don't always engage honestly with the process or apply insights to their actual relationships. Mark's response to Jake's call was characteristically supportive and thoughtful. He encouraged me to take whatever time I needed to process the information and decide how, if at all, I wanted to respond to Kyle's situation. He made it clear that he would support any decision I made, whether that involved maintaining complete distance or exploring limited contact with family members who might be capable of genuine change. The conversation with Dr. Mitchell that followed Jake's call helped me understand that Kyle's accident didn't create any moral obligation for me to sacrifice my boundaries or well-being for his family's emotional needs. She reminded me that my decision to cut contact had been based on a pattern of abuse and enabling that had persisted for years despite multiple opportunities for accountability and change. One crisis situation, even a serious one, didn't erase that history or automatically restore trust that had been systematically destroyed. However, Dr. Mitchell also helped me explore whether Kyle's condition might represent an opportunity to evaluate whether any family members had developed the capacity for healthier relationships. She suggested that crisis situations sometimes strip away pretense and reveal people's authentic priorities and capabilities, potentially providing useful information about who might be worth maintaining relationships with going forward. After several days of consideration, I decided to maintain my boundaries around Kyle and Linda while exploring the possibility of limited contact with Dad if he had genuinely begun to understand and address his role in enabling family dysfunction. I wrote a carefully worded email to Jake explaining that I was willing to have one phone conversation with Dad about his therapy work and insights, with the understanding that this didn't represent a commitment to resumed contact or family reconciliation. Dad's voice when he called 3 days later was different from any conversation I remembered having with him throughout my adult life. Instead of the defensive, conflict-avoidant tone that had characterized our previous interactions, he sounded tired, honest, and genuinely accountable for his failures as a parent. He began the conversation by acknowledging that Kyle's accident had forced him to confront truths about his family that he had been avoiding for years, and that his therapy work had revealed patterns of enabling and conflict avoidance that had allowed serious harm to occur under his roof. The conversation that followed was unlike any discussion I had ever had with Dad about family dynamics. He took full responsibility for his failure to protect me from Kyle's abuse, acknowledging that his desire to maintain peace in his marriage had led him to minimize and dismiss clear evidence of deliberate cruelty. He expressed genuine remorse for the years of gaslighting and manipulation I had endured, and admitted that his loyalty to Linda had prevented him from fulfilling his basic obligations as a father. Most importantly, Dad made no attempts to excuse his behavior or suggest that family reconciliation was possible without major changes in family dynamics. He acknowledged that Linda's manipulation tactics were abusive and that her enabling of Kyle's behavior had created an unsafe environment for me. He admitted that his marriage might not survive the honest examination of these issues, but that his primary concern was taking responsibility for his failures and finding ways to support my healing, even if that didn't include resuming a relationship with him. The conversation was emotionally overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. Hearing Dad finally validate my experiences and take accountability for his role in enabling my abuse provided a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. At the same time, his genuine remorse and insight made me grieve for the relationship we might have had if he had been capable of this level of honesty and accountability years earlier. Dad's therapy revelations also included disturbing information about Kyle's behavior that I hadn't been aware of during the years I lived within the family system. Apparently, Kyle's targeting of me had been more systematic and calculated than I had realized, involving deliberate strategies to isolate me from potential supporters and undermine my confidence and relationships. Dad had witnessed more instances of Kyle's cruelty than he had ever acknowledged, but had convinced himself that intervention would create more problems than it solved. The most shocking revelation was that Linda had been actively coaching Kyle on manipulation tactics and encouraging his abuse of me as a way to maintain her own position as the favored family member. Dad's therapy work had helped him recognize that Linda's treatment of me hadn't been the result of personality conflicts or misunderstandings, but had been a deliberate campaign to establish dominance and control within the family hierarchy. This information recontextualized years of experiences I had minimized or explained away, helping me understand that I had been the target of coordinated abuse rather than the victim of unfortunate family dynamics. The validation was powerful, but it also intensified my grief about the childhood and family relationships I had lost to systematic mistreatment. Over the following weeks, Dad continued to reach out with updates about his therapy progress and insights about family dysfunction, always respecting my boundaries and making it clear that he expected nothing in return for sharing this information. His willingness to do the emotional work of accountability without demanding forgiveness or reconciliation was evidence of genuine change that distinguished his current behavior from the conflict avoidance and manipulation I had experienced throughout my childhood. Jake served as a valuable intermediary during this period, providing updates about Kyle's medical condition and family dynamics, while maintaining respect for my boundaries and autonomy. Kyle's recovery was slow and uncertain, with brain injury complications that would likely result in permanent cognitive changes and personality modifications. The severity of his condition had apparently shocked Linda into a period of quiet reflection, though Jake remained skeptical about her capacity for lasting change. The information about Kyle's brain injury raised complex ethical questions about accountability and consequences that I struggled to navigate. While I felt genuine sadness about his suffering and wouldn't have wished such severe injuries on anyone, I also couldn't ignore the fact that his current vulnerability was the direct result of choices he had made, including the decision to drive while intoxicated. The accident represented a natural consequence of his self-destructive behavior rather than a random tragedy that erased his responsibility for years of deliberate cruelty. Dr. Mitchell helped me understand that feeling relief about Kyle's inability to continue hurting people was a normal and healthy response that didn't conflict with also feeling compassion for his suffering. She reminded me that my healing didn't require me to forget or minimize Kyle's abuse, and that genuine forgiveness could only occur if I maintained honest acknowledgement of the harm he had caused rather than allowing sympathy for his current condition to erase the reality of his past behavior. As Kyle's condition stabilized but showed limited signs of cognitive recovery, Dad's therapy work continued to reveal layers of family dysfunction that had shaped decades of relationships. He began to understand how his own childhood experiences with an alcoholic father had trained him to avoid conflict at any cost, even when that avoidance enabled harm to his own children. His insights about generational patterns of dysfunction helped explain his behavior without excusing it, and his commitment to breaking those cycles gave me hope that genuine change might be possible. The most significant development occurred 8 months after Kyle's accident, when Dad made the decision to separate from Linda and file for divorce. The decision came after months of couples therapy sessions that had revealed the extent of Linda's manipulation and abuse, and her unwillingness to take responsibility for her role in creating a toxic family environment. Dad's willingness to prioritize truth and accountability over maintaining his marriage represented a level of courage and integrity I had never seen from him before. Linda's response to the divorce proceedings revealed the depths of her manipulation and vindictiveness when her control tactics were no longer effective. She launched a campaign to turn extended family and community members against Dad, portraying herself as the victim of his midlife crisis and emotional instability. She attempted to use Kyle's condition to gain sympathy and support, claiming that Dad was abandoning his family during their most vulnerable time. However, Linda's efforts to maintain her victim narrative were undermined by the accumulating evidence of her abusive behavior and the testimony of family members who had witnessed her manipulation tactics over the years. Jake's willingness to speak honestly about what he had observed, combined with Dad's documented therapy insights and my own detailed accounts of Linda's harassment after I cut contact, created a clear picture of systematic emotional abuse that was difficult for anyone to ignore or minimize. The divorce process was complicated by Kyle's medical condition and need for ongoing care, but Dad took full responsibility for ensuring Kyle received appropriate support while also protecting himself from Linda's continued
manipulation attempts. He arranged for Kyle to live in a specialized care facility that could manage his brain injury complications while providing the structure and supervision he needed to function safely. Throughout this period of family upheaval, Mark and I continued building our life in Portland with increasing confidence and joy. Our wedding took place on a beautiful autumn day in the Columbia River Gorge, surrounded by friends who had become our chosen family and colleagues who celebrated our happiness without the complications of family drama. Dad was not invited to the wedding, though I sent him photos afterward with a note expressing hope that his continued therapy work might eventually make a relationship between us possible. The decision not to include Dad in our wedding was difficult but necessary, as I wasn't ready to test the boundaries of our tentative reconnection in such an emotionally significant context. Dr. Mitchell had helped me understand that rebuilding trust would be a gradual process that required consistent demonstration of changed behavior over time, rather than dramatic gestures or crisis-driven reconciliation. My career in Portland flourished beyond anything I had imagined possible during the years I spent managing family stress and crisis. The design firm I joined specialized in working with environmental nonprofits and sustainable businesses, allowing me to combine my creative skills with values-based work that felt meaningful and purposeful. My colleagues appreciated my attention to detail, collaborative approach, and ability to remain calm under pressure, skills I had developed through years of navigating family dysfunction but could now apply to positive professional challenges. The Pacific Northwest environment provided endless opportunities for the outdoor activities that had become central to my healing and identity development. Mark and I spent weekends hiking in the Cascade Mountains, exploring the Oregon coast, and camping in national forests that offered the kind of peace and beauty I had never imagined could be part of my regular life. The physical challenges of mountaineering and backpacking provided metaphors for the emotional work of recovery, teaching me that I was capable of enduring difficulty and reaching goals that once seemed impossible. Our social circle in Portland consisted of people who shared our interests in outdoor adventure, environmental activism, and creative pursuits, creating the kind of chosen family relationships that were based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation or shared trauma. The contrast with my family relationships was stark and healing, showing me what healthy connections could look like when built on honesty and compatibility rather than manipulation and control. 18 months after Kyle's accident, I received a letter from him that had been written with assistance from his occupational therapist as part of his cognitive rehabilitation program. The letter was simple and direct, acknowledging that he had hurt me deliberately over many years and expressing regret for his behavior. While the brain injury had affected his memory and emotional processing, his letter suggested that he retain some understanding of the harm he had caused and genuine remorse for his actions. Kyle's letter didn't request forgiveness or contact but simply acknowledged reality in a way he had never been capable of before his accident. The cognitive changes caused by his brain injury had apparently reduced his capacity for manipulation and self-deception, leaving him with a more honest assessment of his behavior and its consequences. While I felt sadness about the circumstances that had led to this clarity, I also appreciated finally receiving acknowledgement of experiences that had been denied and minimized for years. The letter prompted another conversation with Dr. Mitchell about forgiveness, accountability, and the possibility of limited contact with Kyle given his changed circumstances.
She helped me understand that while Kyle's acknowledgement was meaningful, his cognitive limitations meant that he would never be able to fully understand or repair the damage he had caused. Any contact with him would need to be based on his current capacity rather than hopes for complete resolution of past harm. After considerable thought, I decided to respond to Kyle's letter with a brief note acknowledging his apology and wishing him well in his recovery, while making it clear that I wouldn't be pursuing ongoing contact or visiting him. The response felt appropriate given his effort to take responsibility but also maintain the boundaries necessary to protect my own well-being and continued healing. 3 years after cutting contact with my family, Dad and I began having monthly phone conversations that gradually rebuilt a relationship based on honesty, accountability, and mutual respect. His divorce from Linda had been finalized, and his continued therapy work had given him tools for recognizing and interrupting the patterns of conflict avoidance and enabling that had characterized his previous relationships. Dad's transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it was genuine and sustained in ways that convinced me he was capable of being a safe person to have in my life. He never pressured me to resume contact with other family members, never minimized the harm I had experienced, and never suggested that my boundaries were excessive or unnecessary. His respect for my autonomy and his willingness to do the work of change without expecting immediate forgiveness created the foundation for a new relationship that honored both our shared history and our individual growth. The relationship I rebuilt with Dad was different from anything we had shared during my childhood or young adulthood. It was based on acceptance of who we both actually were rather than roles we were expected to play, and it included honest discussions about family history and dysfunction that would have been impossible during the years when maintaining peace was more important than telling the truth. Most importantly, Dad's accountability and change created space for me to process and integrate my family experiences in ways that promoted healing rather than continued trauma. His validation of my experiences and genuine remorse for his failures helped me let go of the anger and resentment that had been necessary for my initial survival and protection but were no longer serving my growth and happiness. Jake and I maintained our relationship as well, though it remained limited by his continued contact with Linda and his loyalty to family relationships that I couldn't participate in safely. His respect for my boundaries and his own insights about family dysfunction made him a valuable ally and supporter, even when our relationships with other family members created natural limitations on how close we could become. 5 years after disappearing from my family's life, Mark and I welcomed our first child, a daughter we named Claire, whose birth represented the beginning of a family legacy based on love, respect, and emotional safety rather than obligation and control. Dad's relationship with Claire was carefully supervised and boundaried, but his genuine delight in his granddaughter and his commitment to breaking generational patterns of dysfunction made him a positive presence in her life. The experience of becoming a parent intensified my gratitude for the work I had done to heal from family trauma and establish healthy relationship patterns. Watching Claire's natural trust and openness reminded me of what childhood should look like when children are protected and valued rather than used as emotional regulation tools for dysfunctional adults. My commitment to providing her with the security and respect I had never received became a powerful motivation for continued growth and healing. Linda's absence from our family celebrations and milestones was a source of relief rather than sadness, confirming that my decision to cut contact had been necessary and appropriate. The peace and joy that characterized our gatherings without her manipulation and drama provided stark contrast to the tension and anxiety that had defined family events during my childhood and young adulthood. Kyle remained in supervised care, his cognitive limitations preventing him from living independently but also reducing his capacity for the kind of calculated cruelty that had characterized his behavior before the accident. While I felt compassion for his circumstances, I never regretted my decision to protect myself from his abuse, and his current vulnerability didn't erase the years of deliberate harm he had caused when he was fully capable of making different choices. The optometrist's report that had started my journey toward freedom and healing remained in my files as a reminder of the importance of seeking professional validation when family members deny or minimize abuse. Dr. Chen's documentation had provided the objective evidence I needed to trust my own perceptions and make decisions based on reality rather than the false narratives my family had constructed to protect themselves from accountability. Looking back on the years of abuse, manipulation, and gaslighting I had endured, I felt profound gratitude for the strength and wisdom that had enabled me to recognize the dysfunction and take action to protect myself. The decision to disappear from my family's life had been the most difficult and important choice I had ever made, creating space for healing, growth, and the development of relationships based on genuine love and respect. The life Mark and I built together in Portland, surrounded by chosen family and meaningful work, exceeded anything I had imagined possible during the years I spent managing family crisis and absorbing abuse. Our relationship provided daily evidence that love could be safe, supportive, and nurturing rather than conditional and manipulative, and our daughter's healthy development confirmed that breaking cycles of family dysfunction was possible with commitment and hard work. The journey from victim to survivor to thriving adult had required years of therapy, boundary setting, and conscious choices to prioritize my own well-being over family expectations. The process had been painful and sometimes lonely, but it had ultimately led to a life characterized by authenticity, peace, and genuine happiness rather than the constant anxiety and self-doubt that had defined my existence within the family system. Sometimes the greatest act of love we can perform for ourselves and others is the courage to disappear until we find people who see our true worth and treat us with the respect we deserve. My stepbrother's deliberate destruction of my glasses had been intended to humiliate and control me, but it ultimately became the catalyst for a transformation that freed me from years of systematic abuse and enabled me to build a life worthy of the person I had always been underneath the damage. 7 years have passed since I made the decision that changed the trajectory of my entire life, and I can honestly say that disappearing from my family's toxic dynamics was the single most important act of self-preservation I have ever undertaken. As I write this, I'm sitting in the home office of our beautiful craftsman-style house in the Alberta Arts District of Portland, watching my 3-year-old daughter Claire play in our backyard garden while my husband Mark prepares dinner in the kitchen. The sounds of genuine laughter and peaceful conversation that fill our home every evening serve as a constant reminder of how different life can be when it's built on a foundation of mutual respect and emotional safety. The contrast between my current life and the anxiety-filled existence I endured for so many years still takes my breath away sometimes. There are moments when I catch myself marveling at the simple pleasure of coming home from work without wondering what crisis or manipulation attempt might be waiting for me. The absence of that constant hypervigilance has allowed parts of my personality to emerge that I never knew existed during the years I spent navigating Kyle's abuse and Linda's controlling behavior. My career has flourished in ways that would have been impossible if I had remained trapped in family dysfunction. Last year, I was promoted to creative director at Green Future Design, the sustainable branding firm where I've worked since moving to Portland. The promotion came with the opportunity to lead a team of talented designers on high-profile campaigns for environmental organizations and ethical businesses across the Pacific Northwest. The confidence and leadership skills I've developed through years of therapy and healthy relationships have translated into professional success that feels both earned and sustainable. The irony isn't lost on me that the same attention to detail and ability to see patterns that made me hyper-aware of Kyle's escalating abuse also make me exceptional at my job. The difference is that now I use those skills to create beautiful, meaningful work that promotes positive change in the world, rather than simply trying to survive in an environment designed to keep me off balance and questioning my own perceptions. Mark and I recently celebrated our 5th wedding anniversary with a trip to Iceland, something that would have been impossible during the years when my emotional and financial resources were constantly drained by family crisis management. We spent 2 weeks hiking glaciers, exploring volcanic landscapes and marveling at the northern lights, creating memories that belong entirely to us without the shadow of family obligation or the fear of future manipulation attempts. Our marriage has deepened into something I never believed was possible during my 20s when every romantic relationship was sabotaged by my family's interference or my own inability to trust that someone could love me without expecting me to minimize myself in return. Mark's consistent respect for my boundaries and his genuine delight in my happiness have shown me what partnership looks like when it's based on equality and mutual support rather than control and emotional manipulation. The decision to start a family was one we approached thoughtfully, knowing that my own childhood experiences would require extra attention to creating healthy patterns for the next generation. Claire's arrival 3 years ago marked not just the beginning of her life, but the completion of a cycle of healing that began when I first walked away from the barbecue where Kyle destroyed my glasses. Watching her develop her own personality and preferences without fear of criticism or manipulation feels like witnessing a miracle every single day. Claire's relationship with my father, her grandfather, has become one of the most healing aspects of my life. Dad's genuine transformation through years of therapy and his commitment to breaking generational patterns of dysfunction have made him a wonderful grandfather who delights in Claire's curiosity and creativity without trying to control or shape her into something she's not. Their weekly video calls are filled with silly songs, story time, and the kind of unconditional acceptance I spent decades craving from family relationships. The boundaries I maintain around Claire's exposure to other family members remain firm and non-negotiable. She knows she has a grandfather who loves her very much, but she has no contact with Linda or knowledge of Kyle's existence. These limitations aren't based on anger or revenge, but on the practical reality that some people are simply not safe to have around children, regardless of their biological connections or legal family status. Linda's attempts to gain access to Claire through various manipulation tactics have been consistently unsuccessful, partly because Dad refuses to serve as an intermediary for contact I haven't approved, and partly because I've built a support network of friends and chosen family who understand the importance of protecting children from emotionally abusive relatives. The restraining order I obtained years ago remains in effect, providing legal backup for the personal boundaries that keep our family safe from her continued attempts at control and manipulation. Kyle's situation has remained relatively stable since his brain injury, though his cognitive limitations mean he requires ongoing supervised care and will never live independently. The facility where he resides provides regular updates to Dad about his condition, but I maintain no direct contact or involvement in his care decisions. While I feel genuine compassion for his circumstances, I've learned that sympathy for someone's current suffering doesn't obligate me to forget the deliberate harm they caused when they were fully capable of making different choices. The most surprising development in recent years has been the strengthening of my relationship with Jake, who has become something approaching a genuine brother figure in ways that our childhood family dynamics never allowed. His decision to maintain limited contact with Linda while respecting my complete separation from her has required careful navigation, but his commitment to honesty and his own therapy work have made it possible for us to build an adult relationship based on mutual respect rather than shared trauma. Jake's wedding last year was the first family event I attended since the barbecue incident 7 years earlier, and the experience provided powerful evidence of how much our family dynamics have changed. The celebration was joyful and relaxed, with Dad serving as the proud father figure and Jake's chosen family creating an atmosphere of love and acceptance. Linda's absence was noticeable but not disruptive, and the event proceeded without the undercurrent of tension and manipulation that had characterized every family gathering during my childhood and early adulthood. Dr. Mitchell, my therapist, retired last year after helping me through nearly 6 years of healing and growth, but our final sessions included reflection on how far I've traveled from the anxious, people-pleasing person who first sought her help. Her validation and guidance were instrumental in helping me understand that my family's treatment of me was abuse, rather than unfortunate personality conflicts, and that establishing boundaries wasn't selfish or dramatic but necessary and healthy. The transition to a new therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, has focused more on maintaining the emotional health I've achieved rather than recovering from active trauma. Our sessions often center on parenting challenges and the ongoing work of modeling healthy relationship skills for Claire while continuing to process the grief that comes with accepting the family relationships I'll never have. One of the most profound realizations of recent years has been understanding that my healing doesn't require forgiveness of people who haven't earned it through genuine accountability and changed behavior. For decades I believed that my own emotional freedom depended on finding ways to excuse or minimize the harm others had caused me, but therapy helped me understand that true healing comes from accepting reality rather than trying to transform it into something more palatable. I don't forgive Kyle for his years of systematic cruelty, and I don't forgive Linda for her manipulation and enabling of abuse. Their actions caused real damage that affected my ability to trust others, form healthy relationships, and feel safe in my own family for most of my childhood and young adulthood. Acknowledging that harm honestly, without minimizing it for others' comfort, has been essential to my ability to build authentic relationships and make decisions based on my actual experiences rather than the false narratives my family constructed to avoid accountability. At the same time, I've found peace with the reality that Kyle and Linda are deeply damaged people whose behavior toward me was more about their own dysfunction than any inherent flaw in my character or worth as a person. This understanding doesn't excuse their choices or obligate me to maintain relationships with them, but it has freed me from the anger and resentment that once consumed so much of my emotional energy. The community Mark and I have built in Portland represents everything I hoped family relationships could be but never experienced until I found the courage to create my own support network. Our closest friends have become Claire's chosen aunts and uncles, providing her with a rich network of caring adults who celebrate her accomplishments and offer guidance without trying to control her development or use her to meet their own emotional needs. Our monthly dinner parties and holiday celebrations are filled with laughter, honest conversation, and the kind of relaxed warmth that I once thought only existed in movies or other people's families. These gatherings have taught Claire that family can be defined by love and commitment rather than biology, and that healthy relationships involve people who enjoy each other's company rather than simply tolerating each other out of obligation. The professional recognition I've received in recent years has included speaking engagements about design ethics and sustainability, opportunities that have allowed me to share my expertise while building confidence in my own voice and perspectives. Standing in front of audiences of creative professionals and business leaders, discussing concepts I'm passionate about without fear of contradiction or manipulation, feels like the fullest expression of the person I was always meant to become. The success of Green Future Design has also created opportunities for me to mentor young designers who are just starting their careers, and I've found deep satisfaction in helping them develop both their creative skills and their professional boundaries. Many of these emerging professionals come from challenging family backgrounds themselves, and I've been able to share insights about maintaining personal well-being while building career success that I wish someone had offered me during my early professional years. Mark's career in sustainable technology has flourished alongside my own professional growth, and our shared commitment to environmental and social responsibility has become a central part of our family identity. We've been able to use our combined resources to support causes we believe in while also creating financial security that ensures Claire will have opportunities and choices that extend far beyond anything I had access to during my own childhood. The house we purchased 2 years ago in Alberta represents the physical manifestation of the life we've built together, with space for Mark's home office, my design studio, Claire's playroom, and a garden, where we grow vegetables and flowers that reflect our commitment to sustainable living. Every room contains evidence of our shared values and individual personalities, creating an environment that feels authentically ours rather than designed to meet others' expectations or avoid potential criticism. Claire's bedroom, decorated with her own artwork and filled with books that celebrate creativity and curiosity, represents everything I want her childhood to embody. She falls asleep each night surrounded by evidence of her own worth and potential, in a home where her thoughts and feelings are valued and respected rather than dismissed or manipulated. The security and confidence she radiates at age 3 would have been impossible for me to maintain at any point during my own childhood. The photographs displayed throughout our home tell the story of a family built on choice and commitment rather than obligation and shared trauma. Pictures from our wedding, vacation adventures, Claire's milestones, and gatherings with chosen family create a visual narrative of joy and authentic connection that stands in stark contrast to the forced smiles and underlying tension that characterized family photos from my youth. Dr. Chen's report about Kyle's deliberate destruction of my glasses, which I still keep in my files as a reminder of the importance of seeking professional validation when others deny your experiences, has been joined by other documentation of my healing journey. Therapy notes, journals from my early years of recovery, and letters from friends who supported my decision to establish boundaries create a record of transformation that sometimes amazes me with its scope and depth. The woman I've become bears little resemblance to the anxious, self-doubting person who spent decades trying to earn love from people who were incapable of providing it. The confidence I've developed through years of healthy relationships and professional success feels solid and authentic rather than dependent on others' approval or validation. I know my own worth now in ways that don't require external confirmation, though I deeply appreciate the love and respect I receive from the people I've chosen to share my life with. Claire's 4th birthday party next month will be the largest gathering we've hosted, with friends from work, our hiking group, the neighborhood, and Dad traveling from Ohio to celebrate with us. The guest list represents the community we've built through years of choosing connection over convenience and authenticity over obligation. Every person attending the party will be there because they genuinely care about Claire and our family, not because of biological relationships or social expectations. The cake will be homemade, the decorations will reflect Claire's current obsession with butterflies and rainbows, and the atmosphere will be filled with the kind of unconditional celebration that every child deserves. There will be no undercurrent of criticism, no passive-aggressive comments disguised as humor, and no one will leave feeling diminished or attacked. The contrast with family gatherings from my own childhood will be stark and healing. As I watch Claire play in our garden, her laughter carrying through the open windows while Mark hums contentedly in the kitchen, I'm struck by the profound gratitude I feel for the courage I found 7 years ago to protect myself from abuse and create space for this life to emerge. The decision to disappear from my family's dysfunction wasn't easy or painless, but it was necessary and ultimately transformative. The optometrist's note that validated my experience of Kyle's deliberate violence was just the beginning of a journey toward understanding that my perceptions were accurate, my boundaries were reasonable, and my worth wasn't dependent on others' ability to see and respect it. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is to vanish from situations that diminish us until we find people who celebrate our true value. My story isn't unique in its details, but it represents a universal truth about the power of choice and the possibility of transformation when we find the courage to prioritize our own well-being over others' comfort. Every day, I meet people who are struggling with similar decisions about toxic family relationships, abusive partners, or manipulative friendships, and I share my experience as evidence that it's possible to build a beautiful life, even after walking away from relationships that seemed permanent and irreplaceable. The life Mark, Claire and I share represents everything I dreamed of during the darkest moments of family crisis and self-doubt. It's proof that love can be safe, families can be chosen, and happiness is possible when we refuse to accept treatment that diminishes our humanity. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is the willingness to disappear from what we know in order to discover what we deserve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.